previous writing, you said ARM will lose its neutrality completely if acquired by Nvidia. Could you elaborate more on the statement?
Let's look a little bit at the history of ARM. I mean, ARM was a spin-out from a personal computer company, PC company in the UK back in the mid-1980s. And they really pioneered the model of processor IP licensing. And their approach was, at that time, quite revolutionary. If you were designing a processor back in the mid-1980s, you generally were wanting to create a chip and to sell that chip, whereas their model was to license the intellectual property to semiconductor or systems companies. And so their approach was to regard the semiconductor companies not as competition, but as partners. They built their licensing model in the 1980s and 90s to be in a position of neutrality compared with other players in the semiconductor industry. So first of all, they were not competing with the semiconductor vendors because they were not producing chips. They were only licensing intellectual property. Secondly, they were independent of some of the other players in the ecosystem, such as EDA vendors. So for example, in the 1990s, I worked for Synopsys, and ARM would always say in meetings, well, we are agnostic. We want to work with Synopsys, Mentor, Cadence. So they deliberately position themselves in a position of neutrality. And this is one reason why they really won the trust of the semiconductor industry worldwide, because they just weren't a competition. Now that became under threat with the acquisition by SoftBank because they were an investor. If SoftBank could get a better return on their investment by selling ARM somewhere else, then of course it was in their interests to do that. And already a few years ago, there was a certain amount of unease in the industry about that acquisition. Nvidia is a semiconductor vendor who are a very strong player in GPUs, but they're also moving into other areas such as artificial intelligence. Now, if we look at the other GPU manufacturers like AMD, Intel, Asus, among others, and most of these companies also license from ARM. So they are suddenly in the uncomfortable position that if Nvidia acquires ARM, they are dependent on technology from one of their main competitors. The same applies for AI, a new area for everybody. You don't want to be dependent on your competitors for your key technologies. So I think this is why there is widespread unease in the semiconductor industry with the Nvidia acquisition.
Doesn't Nvidia worry about the objections in the industry that ARM might lose all of its customers once been acquired?
Of course, ARM has dominated a number of different markets. They've dominated the application processor market, particularly mobile. They've dominated embedded. Depending on the application, moving away from ARM may be straightforward or it may be quite difficult. The main issue is to what degree is it going to be painful to move away from ARM based on your existing software investment. Now, if you think about it, there are some markets, like for example, the PC market or the mobile phone market, where there has been a dominant player in terms of processor. In the case of PCs or in the server market, it's been the x86 architecture. And there is a very large investment in software in that. The same applies to the mobile phone market, where Android is the dominant operating system. And although Android has been ported to other processor architectures, the majority of the industry has gone with ARM. You can't turn a switch and move away from it. On the other hand, we have other parts of the industry which are far more flexible. There are what I would call greenfield areas like artificial intelligence, where there is no history and no historic software development. Everything basically is new. So in something like artificial intelligence, there's no compelling reason to go to x86 or to ARM. You really have a very free choice, and you can make your investment based on the requirements of your business. Another area which is far more flexible is embedded. If you think of a PC or a mobile phone, people expect everything to install easily, even third-party applications that come through something like an app store, that all has to just work out of the box very simply. In the case of embedded and some of the other specialized applications, then in these cases, people are used to even taking source code, compiling it, linking it with other things, and creating a custom software solution. So moving to a new architecture away from ARM in that case is much simpler.